Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Andrea Milan, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for the Global Center for Climate Mobility, the global partner for this important symposium. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I would like to thank the organizers for making this possible. And importantly, today I have the privilege to introduce you to our first keynote speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Ferris. So my thanks goes to her as well for taking the time to speak with us today. Dr. Elizabeth Ferris is a senior fellow and was previously a director for the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining Georgetown, Dr. Ferris was a senior fellow and co-director of the Brookings Project on Internal Displacement. Dr. Ferris spent 20 years working in the field of humanitarian assistance, most recently in Geneva at the World Council of Churches. From 2019 to 2021, she served as an expert advisor to the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement, a historic effort at the UN. Last but not least, more specifically to the conversation today, Dr. Ferris has worked on planned relocation since 2010, including developing key guidance and a toolbox for those that are planning relocating communities. And I think these documents that I'm sure she will refer to today have been a key reference for those of us working in this space since the beginning of the 2010s. Before we start, just two practical notes. One is you will have received the notification that we are recording today's session. The second, I would really encourage everybody. I know sometimes the distance and the not being in the same room makes us think twice before we ask a question, but we really would like to hear from you. So please do ask questions in the Q&A section anytime. And we will have time for a few questions at the end. So without further ado, Dr. Ferris, floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you. And kudos to the organizers for putting together this terrific 3-day program. You've really covered, a lot of the very important topics. And I enjoyed the sessions I participated in this morning. So today I'm going to talk to you about planned relocations. This is, traditionally one of the 3 forms of climate-related mobility identified by the COP decision way back in 2010, and probably the least studied of the types of mobility that we see. Let me just move this over here. Okay, there are 2 photos here. The one on the left is of a small town in Alaska, Kivalina, Alaska, which 30 years ago was identified, or 20 years ago was identified as one of the 30 indigenous Alaskan communities that needed to be relocated because the environmental situation had become so dire due to melting permafrost, coastal erosion, storm surges. And the photo on the right is of Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, also in the United States, a community that went through a very painful process of relocating just 40 miles away, 60 kilometers, and just recently completed that move. So when we talk about planned relocations, I want to emphasize these are complicated processes. This is a major undertaking. It's much more than physically moving people, which is what people often assume, the logistics of how to move people and give them new houses and a place that's safer, but it involves much more than that. There's a growing body of research on planned relocations, but it's still really, really limited. The Platform on Disaster Displacement and the Calder Center put out a study a few years ago documenting some 300 cases, and since then we've heard about another 100 or so. But a lot of the relocations that have taken place have been under the radar. They haven't been written up. There's a lot more research on North America and the Pacific than there is, say, on Africa or Latin America or even Asia. As Erica Bauer, who's worked on this issue for a long time, has often said, this is a global phenomenon, but every context is different. What works in the relocation of a community in Alaska is different than relocating people in New Zealand after an earthquake or in Panama due to coastal erosion. There's general consensus that planned relocation should be the last resort after every other adaptation effort has been exhausted. That was most recently reaffirmed by the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of IDPs in her report on planned relocation last year. But, think about the people who don't move away when things get rough, the populations that tend to live in environmentally risky areas. Often they're populations, they're groups that are marginalized politically and economically, often neglected by the government, often don't trust the government. So planned relocations are very different in different contexts, but particularly because you're often dealing with people who haven't had the means or the opportunity or the will to move earlier. Two introductory comments. One is, what is a planned relocation? This is the definition that was developed back in 2015. It probably needs some tweaking now, but it's a planned process. It isn't spontaneous, in which people or groups of people, really communities, move or are assisted to move away from their homes or places of temporary residence. That's to include long-term migrants, for example. They're settled in a new location and provided with the conditions for rebuilding their lives. It's intended to be permanent, unlike evacuations, which are intended to be temporary. The state has authority over planned relocations. It takes place within national borders. We didn't look at international relocations, which is another even more complicated issue. And it's intended to protect people from the risks of disasters and the effects of climate change. We know that sometimes governments say it's for environmental reasons when they plan a relocation, but maybe there are other economic or political interests involved. A second big question that hasn't yet been answered is, what do we mean by a successful planned relocation? Do relocated people remain where they are, where they've been relocated? There are lots of cases where relocations have been started and people aren't happy and move back to where they are. Are they safer from natural hazards? Do they have less climate risk? This is the main purpose of these relocations. Are they able to thrive? Do they have access to services and livelihoods, political participation and justice? Are they healthy? Are they able to maintain their cultures and community cohesion? Cultural issues are sometimes even more important than economics or physical movement. What about people besides those being relocated? What happens with the people who stay behind? And what about those who live nearby but don't fall into the area to be relocated? Sometimes their climate risk is just as great as those who are moved. And when should outcomes be assessed? After a year, after a decade, after a couple of decades? I think we really need to grapple with this question of, what does it mean to have a successful planned relocation? So in terms of the title of this talk is what works and what doesn't work. So just to zip through kind of the consensus of some of the experiences we've had so far with planned relocations. Probably most important is the engagement of affected communities. And here we're talking about people to be relocated. We're talking about people staying behind and with others who may be affected by moving a whole community. And here I want to emphasize that there's really a continuum of engagement. In most planned relocations, there are certainly meetings between the community and the government, but most of those meetings are informational, where the government authorities say, well, this is what's going to happen, this is where you'll move, this is the kind of housing we're thinking about developing, et cetera. They're more providing information, not really consulting, much less full participation of affected communities. So we go from providing information to consultation, which involve, well, what do you think about this? Or what are your concerns? Or, what should be done? But, if there isn't a mechanism to translate those concerns into policies, into actions, consultation can be very frustrating when groups feel like, well, we gave our input and it was ignored and the government went ahead with its plans already, to participation, where in fact it's affected communities that are an integral part of the process or are even in the driving seat. And there are a number of cases where communities themselves have identified they have to move, there are no other options, and where the communities themselves develop the policies and processes and procedures. It seems that those are probably in a minority. The study I mentioned earlier found that about half of the documented cases of planned relocations, about half, had some mechanism for community engagement. Something else that's important is a comprehensive planning process involving multiple stakeholders. To move a whole community means dealing with things like schools. Will you build a new school and hire new teachers for the new location, or will everybody just be moved? And what happens to the school back in the community of origin? If there's some people who don't move, will they still have a school in their community? There are a range of infrastructure issues around transportation, roads, electricity, water, sanitation, where you really need the involvement of different ministries or different governmental agencies who deal with these particular issues. Oftentimes, religious communities, spiritual leaders are important, particularly when dealing with the always difficult issue of cultural heritage. And in some communities, leaving behind a cemetery is terribly important. In others, the issue of not being able to see the sea, which has been a part of their culture of a community, as in Sao Tome and Principe, was a major factor in determining the shape of the relocation, but involving multiple stakeholders. And here I would also include the business sector. We haven't seen much information about relocating businesses, but you can imagine a community where, say, there's a local bakery that provides not only bread, but also jobs. Should a planned relocation also move the business? To what extent should, moving livelihoods be a part of the process? A big key to success, power defined, is having enough money, and there is rarely enough money. So I'll talk about more in a minute. Planned relocations tend to be very expensive and often take an awfully long time. And without adequate money, some of the plans simply can't materialize. And some of those might have to do with psychosocial issues or education, less so probably on the issues of housing and logistics, again, which is what most people think of. Is there clear legal authority to oversee the process? Who decides? Who has the right to decide a community should be moved, could be moved? Who can, and what are the proper authorities for acquiring land? Land is always a messy issue. The issue of trust, does the community trust the government and trust the assessments that are done? As I mentioned, often I suspect these are indigenous communities which have a history of not trusting central authority, maybe more so for local authorities. And then there's the need for long-term thinking and political commitment to the community. It's a government that launches an ambitious plan, ready to see it through if problems emerge in a year or two, for example. What doesn't work, and always makes sense when people are left out of decision making, there are lots of examples where planned relocations have occurred without proper input from local communities, and the results have been far from perfect. When attention isn't paid to livelihoods, if people are moved to a new location, even if the new houses are great and there's less environmental risk, if they can't earn a living, they won't stay. They'll either move on or move back. And there have been many studies showing, how people in effect, move because of the effects of climate change or fear of disasters, and yet find they can no longer fish or farm, or the land isn't adequate. And so they find alternatives. And when there isn't enough money and plans can't be completed, it results in frustration all around. Some of the complicating issues are defining community, who is to be included. I mentioned the case of Ile Jean Charles in Louisiana, where since 2012, bad hurricane, a lot of the young people, a lot of the economically active people couldn't get to their jobs because of the environmental conditions, and so they moved. Should they be allowed to be included in the new relocated community? They were affected by the same climate issues, but left. And thinking about this question of who is left behind, it's more difficult to relocate and recreate a viable economic community if a lot of the young people and a lot of the economically active people have migrated earlier, leaving behind older people who may have less time recreating a viable, sustainable economy. Land issues always complicated, particularly when in systems of customary or land tenure, informal land tenure. And the literature is ripe with references to differences between different governmental agencies and often differences between national and local authorities. And kind of large-scale relocations that have taken place in Vietnam, for example, policies were set at the national level. Local authorities who knew their communities better, had very little input into that process. Local authorities have to be included. And finally, this financing issue. A new study just came out last week from UN University Funding Futures that surveyed where does the money come from for planned relocations and how much do they cost? They seem to range from $1 million to $100 million, and it doesn't seem related to the number of people being moved. The study found that in the global north, it's usually governments who end up paying for most of it. In the global south, it's usually international funds. Most communities don't have the wherewithal to raise the necessary funds themselves. Budgeting is complicated, what to include. I know in Latin America has come up with a new costing tool, including costs for psychosocial counseling of people who are depressed in their new location. Everybody is looking to climate finance to provide the answer. But here you have a question also raised in the previous session of, is planned relocation a loss, which could be financed by loss and damage? Or is it a positive adaptation to climate change? And maybe climate adaptation funds might be more appropriate. Right now, I think people are looking at both different tracks of financing. And finally, some concluding thoughts. Planned relocations have been used a lot. There are hundreds of cases around the world. They're probably going to be used much more in the future. Documentation and research is really scanty. We need much more evidence to understand what works in a particular context and what doesn't work. And again, one-size-fits-all approaches simply don't work, given the variety of environmental threat and populations and cultures, et cetera. In the toolbox that was developed in 2017, rather than saying government should, communities should, the toolbox says, here are some checklists. Have you thought about the environmental impact in the community you're going to? Have you made sure that women are included in decision-making, et cetera? So there are challenges to communities themselves to assess environmental risks, to adaptation or disaster risk reduction measures to enable them to stay where they are. Most communities want to stay where they are. They don't want to be forced to leave. Challenge to policymakers is to begin planning now. It takes time to do these, work out a comprehensive plan for relocating even a small settlement, particularly with inclusive process. And here a challenge to researchers, we need more case studies, more surveys of affected communities. I've only, all the literature I've only seen one study that went back and asked people who are relocated, was it a good decision? Are you better off? What have been the trade-offs you've had to make? What should have been done? And I haven't seen any systematic surveys of people left behind. What is it like when most of your community leaves? Do you have more access to resources because there's less pressure on the environment, or the lack of services a major challenge? And much more longitudinal research. We have snapshots of planned relocations, but what happens over time? That's where we'll find out whether or not these are really a good alternative in adapting to climate change. So thank you. Stay tuned. Happy to respond to any questions. This is a photo of the little town of Newtok, Alaska, which was moved finally last year, after working since 1996 to get funding to relocate. But you can see the kind of the future when some communities aren't relocated and the coastal soil erodes and the houses begin to sink and communities are in effect abandoned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And at least my watch says it's 22, so I think you are exactly on time. And I have I see a couple of questions, and maybe I'll split that in two. Since Paul, our lead organizers, I'll beg your patience. I'll start with the second question from Steve Bertman, who is asking whether there are some countries or governments that have been more successful in planned relocations, and if so, why? And if I may, Beth, I'll add because I had a question of my own that is sort of related, which is you mentioned at the beginning that there's a bias in the studies being more often from North America and the Pacific. So it would be great as you answer the very important question, if you could also think about, basically, would your talk would have been very different today if, say, the bias was not there, or even if we had more studies from Africa, etc. So I'll add that subcomponent. Over to you, Beth.
Well, we'll start with your second question. I mean, I think if we had a more representative sample, and particularly Africa, there aren't many studies that are widely available, at least, of relocations in Africa. The ones that do exist are fascinating. They show, different dynamics and different political processes, different community concerns. So I think we need more. And so, yes, I think the messages would be different if we had a larger number of cases to look at. In terms of countries that have been particularly successful, of course, Fiji comes to mind. Fiji is the only country, I think, in the world that has a dedicated fund to support planned relocations, really thinking ahead in terms of what's needed. They have good policies. They've carried out a number of these relocations. There's been good level of community engagement. These are never perfect. They're never perfect experiences, but Fiji stands out, and other Pacific Island countries have either developed or are in the process of developing good policies. The United States has no national policy. There's no single person in charge of this. The Obama administration tried to set up a process, and certainly indigenous communities in Alaska were really excited about it. And then, of course, that has come to a full stop right now. And, so different countries have different responses, but there are very few dedicated policies on planned relocations.
Thank you. Next question with thanks, Paul, for all the work you do also for this, and you did for this workshop to happen, is about the costs. Paul flags that it looks that like some relocations that have been taken place have been extremely expensive. So how serious, or maybe I would add, how realistic also in many instances is it to have planned relocation? Thank you, and then we'll go to the...
Yeah, there are a number of cases where communities have been identified to need to be relocated, and the money just isn't there, and so the plans have been abandoned. Again, the costs have been astronomical. The small community of Ile Jean Charles got a $48 million grant to move 100 people. The cost of relocating Newtok, this small community of 300 people in Alaska, is somewhere around 100 million. Less expensive in other regions, but not terribly less expensive. A case in the Maldives where people were relocated and was financed by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, cost $35 million. But when you start getting into these numbers, and then when you start adding up the number of communities that should be relocated, it just becomes overwhelming. And I think governments say, oh, there's no way we can afford that. And so they just back off. I mean, I have more hope in some of the community initiated led relocations that, probably cost less money. Probably fewer consultants are hired to do all of the studies that go into these. But still, I mean, I think the cost is huge. And that's one of the reasons why, the guidance is, a last resort, try everything else to protect a community, to enable them to stay where they are. It just doesn't work if you multiply this out by the thousands of communities, maybe tens of thousands of communities that, better times would be better off if they were physically located somewhere else.
Thank you. And I think we have a great last question to wrap this up from Manjusha, hoping I'm pronouncing it right, who challenges to think about basically both think ahead in the long term, but also think about the historical depth of the discussion. So, what do we know about the relocations pre-2010s when this started, and also to what extent, I'm summarizing a bit, to what extent is the future generations and their well-being, to what extent are these taken into account? So, great way to conclude, I think, is to think back and also think forward a little further.
Well, that's a great question. There have been some historical studies. Jane McAdam in the Pacific has looked at some of the colonial efforts to move whole populations, mainly for economic reasons. And one of her interesting findings in comparing a couple of these cases in the Pacific Islands, where, as I said, whole communities were moved to different islands, is that communities that were part of the process seem to have done much better. There's still resentment, historical animosity to what happened, 50 years ago, by communities whose ancestors were not involved in the relocation. There are a few cases of relocations that have happened, I don't know, early part of the 1900s, and seem to have gone pretty well, but then standards of evaluation have changed as well. And as I said, there have been so few studies asking the affected people, how has it gone? How have you done? And I completely agree. This is an issue for generations to come, because when a community is moved, particularly an indigenous community with deep cultural and spiritual ties to the land, a lot of that is lost when they are put in a different physical location, and the values transmitted and the culture transmitted, and sometimes the language transmitted to future generations is at stake. So there are a lot of really big issues and ethical intergenerational justice issues to consider here.
Thank you very much. And this was the last question, and I think this been a great presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Ferris. I see that anybody who connected is still here, which is the best compliment they can give you. And let me conclude just with a quick word of thanks again to the Western Michigan University, Paul Clemens and the team for all the work they're doing for this to happen. And I invite all participants to stay engaged, remain connected. There's a very rich program coming up, so I look forward to keep connecting with you all over the next few sessions. Thanks again for your wonderful keynote, Dr. Ferris, and thanks to all the participants for your time. And I wish everybody a nice morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you.